And we're live. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, how's everybody doing today?
We're hoping there's some people here. How you doing today, Mark?
You know, I'm doing great.
Did you have a good
Right outside of
Thanksgiving holiday,
DC.
my American friend?
That's right. We have you guys beat us to Thanksgiving as far as the scheduling on the calendar. So
We do.
yes, it was a great. It was really a nice time. How was yours several weeks ago?
Mine several weeks ago was excellent. I actually am in the midst of a 2-week spin right now of chaos, but kind of wonderful chaos.
Mhm.
I have 5
Yeah,
events in 14 days. And
that.
I
Yeah.
tried to do the math on it. I think there are 200 speakers, 5 events, 47 actual talks or pitches. The average length is 5 minutes. The average number of slides is, I think, less than 5, which I'm totally proud of. Working with
Yes,
academics, and less is more.
that's right. I
Less
think
is
that's a
more.
t. I think you need like a concert tour T-shirt.
Less is more.
Lays out all those stats.
So today we're going to talk about connection
Yes.
and how, what, and why. Like a good pedagogue. I put the questions on the board there behind me. I have a new whiteboard.
It's sharp. It looks
It
it
looks
looks
good.
it looks good to me.
It's glass, which I think is kind
Oh,
of fun.
that's cool.
Um, so where do you want to start? Thinking about
I think
connection.
yeah, I think like consistent with the way we have been talking, both here on Sounds of Science and also in our other, social channels and work and all that kind of stuff, kind of grab the listener right away. So we could tell you why to do it, but that seems we can get to that later. It's sort of I think we want to talk about what it is first, briefly, and then how to do it because we're big believers in the power of it. So maybe I'll just start with just a little intro. Many of you know that I have a political background. I worked in the US Congress for a long time, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And politics is really a people business. So connecting with people, meaning like, do people relate to what you're saying? Can they see themselves or aspects of themselves or their experiences in you? um, do you understand sort of, you've heard like sort of cliches like you need to meet people where they are, or essentially they all say the same thing, which is, do you really understand what your group is interested in? We're getting a
I got rid of it.
oh, okay.
I was
And
turning on the feed because I wanted to check and see if anyone's here with us.
okay. But
If
connection.
you're here with us, do chat. Drop a note in the comments. Let us know
Chris,
where you're
thank you for
from.
doing that. Yeah, Chris just grabbed the politics as a people business, and I appreciate that for that comment. And that's really what we are talking about: is relating to other humans as people. What are they interested in? What are they? Um, what do they understand? And then starting, it's sort of like I kind of view it as a precursor or a foundation for effective communication. And I say connect before you communicate. It's more than know your audience. That's a cliche that I hate, because what are you supposed to know about your audience and where do you find that information and then what do you do with it once you find it? It's sort of, for me, it boils down to, I want to kind of demonstrate similarities, or at least an understanding of what my audience is going through, what they understand, what they know, their frame of reference, common experiences, common values, things like that, before I even put together my message, because I kind of want to lead with those things, and this is a political, it kind of, for me, it kind of comes out of the political world, but it's such an important first step to open channels of communication.
I love that you said common experience. If we think about a presentation as an experience, and it's a shared experience that includes both the presenter and the audience and everyone in the audience, and we think about it not as a presentation but a common experience, a shared experience. then connection starts to happen, right? We share through experience, we share through story. There's some fascinating brain research now with fMRI imaging that shows a phenomenon called brain syncing, where when you tell stories and people are immersed in the story, our brains start firing with similar patterns. And it's our whole brain. So it's not just the analytical part of our brain. It's our whole brain. So hearts and minds, that's another one that,
Mhm.
it's cliche, right? Hearts and minds. It's not even accurate because it's actually our whole mind versus just part of our mind, because the
Mhm.
analytics is just part of our mind. Our whole mind is what we're talking about when we talk about connection.
Yeah.
Connecting with
Yeah.
the whole brain versus just the analytic part of the brain. And doing
Right.
that first. Like I think sometimes people tell stories to illustrate, and I always think that's backwards. Lead with stories and then explain. Well, hopefully you don't have to explain
Yeah.
the story too much, but lead with the story versus, well, let me tell you a story about that.
Yeah. 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 So I love it. And one maybe tagline that it builds off of what you just said, Andy. Don't tell stories to illustrate. Tell stories to relate.
I like that. I like that.
Well, so let's should we hear from folks?
Yeah,
Should we talk about
pop
how to do
questions
it
in the
or
pop questions in the comments. I see Chris here. Chris, if you want to share a way, that would be awesome. I'm trying to. Here we go. I think as a
yeah,
presenter, paradox is how do you seek first to understand, then to be understood? If you're at the podium, knowing the audience means trying to understand what the audience is trying to absorb, then try to present it. So I love, Chris, that you're talking about the audience, 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 audience. That's to me is what we all need to do more of. How are people experiencing the moment we're creating, right? How do people experience us as presenters? So rather than thinking about, it's a little bit the famous Maya Angelou quote, right? People will never remember what you say. People never remember what you do. People always remember how you make them feel, how you made them feel. So what is it that we want people to feel, and then how do we do that? And if we mix that with the brain syncing, bring Maya Angelou and the brain syncing together. Um, one of the other brain science things that's very clear, and has lots of support, lots of research behind it, is that emotions are contagious. But if we think of that concept just for a second of emotions are contagious, that means if I want you to catch something, I have to have it.
right,
So as a presenter, if I think about how do I want to make you feel about this, or about our experience together, I have to think about, well then I need to feel that way.
right. Yeah,
Because if I don't feel it, you're not going to feel it.
right, right. And there's a reflex that we have as humans, the reciprocity reflex. So if, I give energy, I'm passionate about what we're talking about. It's authentic, right? We are fired up. We're excited to talk about these things. We think it's really meaningful. Our research can make a difference. The topic that we're talking about makes a difference. It's why we spend a lot of time working it and thinking about it and sharing that passion. Again, we're really talking about general audiences more. I understand, there are sort of frameworks and methodologies you want to use when you're talking in more formal academic settings, for example. But if you're talking to general audiences, and that could be a potential investor, it could be potential a job interview, it could be to a group of fifth graders if you're doing outreach, whatever it happens to be. That's really everything that we're talking about, in this series and also today relates to that general audiences. Is when you mention, Chris, when you talk about knowing what the audience is trying to absorb, you know I like the way you phrase that too, because people absorb. What can the audience absorb? What is the audience interested in absorbing? And it's things that they first of all understand and can visualize, right? Particularly in the beginning, and he was just talking about fMRI, you know, things that things that I want my audience to be thinking along with me, meaning visualizing what I'm saying, into their own, translating into their own experience. It's going to be different from, brain to brain necessarily, perhaps, in the sense that, if I say something, oh, that time of when XYZ happened, people had different experiences, but they're all thinking about, it's tailor made for their own visualization, right? But it I guess the overall point is that you want to tell stories to relate, meaning I could tell an audience, or I could write a piece about anything if I want to give an example. But when I do this, I always do some public, source research on who I'm talking to, looking at social posts, looking at press releases, looking at LinkedIn, and just seeing like what kind of specialties are, academic specialties or backgrounds or even alma maters, or what events have happened recently that people, like the World Cup. So, US just beat Iran 1-0. You know, anything that I can say, particularly in the beginning.
Spoiler alert, I had recorded the game.
Oh God, I'm so sorry, Eddie. I am
That's all
so
right.
sorry. Oh my goodness, that betrays a real like lack of like football or soccer, like whatever. I shouldn't have said that.
No,
But in any case,
you know what though? That's where we are right now, and and look what just happened, right? Like you're sitting there in the moment, thinking about something in real time that's current, and what happened? We're laughing, we're
and
connecting.
it's so
Laughter,
current that you were
laughter's
working on it too. You were
connection,
thinking about
right?
that. Yeah, yeah.
And I think people forget that, like smiling. So like we have a connection theme going on, smiling, laughter. Also, to Chris's point a second ago, a plot, a climax, um, a middle and end. There's pain, there's suffering, there's good, there's bad, and these emotions. When we lean into these emotions, when we allow these emotions to come, when we allow ourselves as presenters. So this gets into a little of the how. Um, what I always encourage people to do in the academic space is think about how they feel about the work they're doing and about this particular piece of the puzzle that they're sharing right now, and lean into that and allow yourself to feel that, because if you allow yourself to feel that, that's where the emotions are contagious come from. That's where that's when the connection can happen. When we get to talking about voice, which is one of my favorite topics, I'm going to come right back to this, right? It's not acting. It's allowing yourself to feel. And for researchers, for academics, for scientists, it's it's against our training. Our training is in this um, being in this objective space. We want to do quantitative work. We want to do rigorous qualitative work. We want to make sure that it's replicable. We want to make sure. So we're trying to distance ourselves from the research. But that makes for a horrible presentation in terms of connecting people to the research. If you're distant from the research, how do we connect to the research? And if we don't connect to the research, it's just data. It's just data. And data doesn't move the needle.
Yeah.
Emotions move the needle. Data supports. We need data. I'm not anti-data. It's just that data's not what moves the needle for action. It supports the desire. but it's not what creates the desire. Does that make sense?
This supporting role that you're talking about too, and I'm glad you underlined that too, Andy, because we want to emphasize everything in these kind of presentations, say to general audiences, it needs to be based on the facts and the evidence as we know it, the best available data, credible information. That's all has to be central. It's necessary though, but not sufficient. And one of my favorite quotes comes from Dr. Joe Hansen, who is on PBS. He has a number of shows on PBS online, and he says that data is a character in your story, but it's not your entire story. And
And
it's
it
not
may
your
not
entire
even be the main character.
right. Yeah. I mean, I think citing data, of course, your audience is kind of interested in some sort of backup, right, for your argument or your presentation. But for them to really get interested in it, a graph is just not going to do it. Maybe one that's very simple or whatever, but people don't think and retain information as well if it's just spreadsheets and scatter plot, graphs and things like that. And so what we're trying to emphasize is something that oftentimes gets skipped over or is viewed as sort of a nice to have, and that's this relatability and connection. And you could argue that with COVID, there were lots of things that went on there as far as messaging and communication and science communication, politics, of course. But you could argue that the fact that the public didn't necessarily relate to a lot of the scientific messengers, many of the scientific messengers, and Andy Fauci would be probably the only exception to that rule. Someone who spent 40 plus years in Washington D.C. talking to policymakers and non-scientists, and the fact that there was that relatability gap really undermined some of the
Some of the
compliance
messaging,
or
right?
the reception. Yeah, the reception. Yeah.
I popped another quote up here from Chris because he talks about the need for space, and I think this is so important. We cram so much into so little. It's like we're living in a TikTok time when it's like, okay, it's got to just be soundbite, 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 soundbite. And to me, the magic of the live presentation space is actually getting away from that and giving people time to think, giving people time to process, giving people time to reflect. And if you don't shut up when you're talking some of the time, like when you're doing a presentation, you ask them to, like, I can't, this happens so often, right? People say, okay, I want you to think about something for a second. They tell you what it is, and then they keep talking. It's like, no, you just asked me to think about it. Either I'm
Right.
not thinking about it or I'm pissed off at you because I want to think about it. Either way, I'm mad at you.
I want to bring in some of the things that Johanna is saying. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly, but you making some great points about stories, and stories are the bridge between research and reality, and they're repeatable. The fact that stories are repeatable, of course, goes back into the mists of history when probably before modern languages were being used. It's just like, it was easy to repeat a story. We remember stories much better, just the way the brain is wired. So, I like to say sometimes, it's again based on research, that in a presentation we are going to forget. Listeners are going to forget 90% of what you say in a presentation within 2 days. This is research that comes out of a behavioral science lab that's done great work, and I would cite them, and I just can't remember the exact name of the organization right now. But the bottom line is, okay, well, if we're going to forget almost the entire thing, you people who are listening to this now, you're going to forget 90% of what we say. You have 10%. So what's your 10% takeaway? And how do you do that? Part of that is presenting information in stories and narratives and weaving data into your narratives. The other part is repetition. The other part is how you made someone feel. Like, Andy was citing the Maya Angelou quote about people will remember how you made them feel. The other thing, last on this connection and feeling, is like, have you ever said, I met that person. We had such a connection. It was terrible. It was awful. I hated it. I couldn't wait to get away from them. We had such a great connection. I just wanted to leave right away. No, it's the opposite of that.
I was
You're
trying to
always
figure out where you're
happy.
going. It's like, what's going on?
Yeah, I had such a
Right.
great connect.
Just
We
doesn't work.
really
Right.
we really connected, and because humans crave connection. And I would, as someone who's a non-scientist, I would say that we crave connection as an evolutionarily positive, beneficial trait, because we needed to be together physically in small groups to survive out there, when we weren't the apex predators. And we still, even though that was thousands of years ago, I guess from a neurological standpoint, it was like a blink of an eye. So a lot of our understandings and motivations are still, based on these old patterns, I think, in the brain.
Right. We'll go back to logos, pathos, ethos, right?
Yeah,
Like
right. Exactly.
connection,
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah. Should we get some questions, Andy, or I want to make sure people
Yeah,
feel like
let's
they have enough?
Chris and Joanne jump in, or anyone else jump in with questions.
Yeah.
I
Some
wanted to,
excellent comments. Yeah.
yeah, fantastic. I wanted to jump in with a something I shared the other day, and see if this resonates with the audience here. I think sometimes we get into this connection space and people are like, yeah, but I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist. And a lot of times I work with people who are either really good at the story part or really good at the science part, but not both. And we've been talking a lot about the story part, a lot about the connection part, a lot about the human part. And and I just want to make sure we recognize that we're not that the science part is important too. It's bringing the two together. One of the things that I say, one of the things that I've started saying, which is what I wanted to share, is you need to be a conversationist before you move to being a scientist. And Chris just put in a comment about the 3MT, and I suspect that it captures this idea. We'll see. Emotions. It's one of the reasons I love the 3MT. Concise stories that let data be the background and the story delivery of the story take center stage. Exactly right. So
Yeah.
it's not there. And Chris, I don't know if you watch Atia's 3MT or not, who just won the Canadian Nationals. She's actually going and competing at Worlds in 2 weeks in California. It's very exciting.
So cool.
Gonna hold all of Canada is gonna cheer her on, or at least all of McGill, Canada. Um, but but it but it's also this. It's also the science part. It's how do we bring those together?
Right.
So
And
she talks about exosomes. She doesn't get away from not sharing technical language. So it's plain language start with plain language, but share the science, share the technical language, teach us something. We want both. It's not one or the other. It's both.
so right, and actually kind of addresses what Johan was talking about. And she also was asking with the name. Maybe can we put something in the chat? Can we put
Yeah,
the
I'll put it in the chat.
yeah,
It's actually on
maybe just a link to the
so
McGill
it's
site or
on
somewhere?
my website.
Okay. While you're doing that, I just want
I
to
just popped it into the chat.
great. I want to highlight the question Johan had, which is
Oh,
if you're
Lafayette. That's
presenting.
so cool. Chris was talking about his experience.
Very cool. Very cool. About Johan's question about if you're talking to another researcher, would you use story? That's an excellent question. And so this is what I've heard from researchers to kind of answer that is if I'm talking to another researcher who's not in my discipline or my lab, say, I need to orient that person first a bit. And that can be done through a story or a what I like to call sometimes a micro story, which is like a rhetorical device, like a metaphor. So you know how sometimes when you're in traffic, you've got this, movements in and out between the lines, and you have some collisions sometimes. It's sort of like what I'm working on is sort of like that. And then you go into, again, if you're talking to another researcher, scientist, for example, then you can go into maybe some more of the science. I think that putting someone in, giving them the right frame of reference can help focus them a bit, and of course help them visualize, because again, I'm using something relatable. Every driver one time or another has probably been in traffic or a traffic jam, so they can visualize that. And then you can take them from that common experience to something they're not familiar with, which is perhaps your research.
I just put up for people where they can find that 3MT talk I was
Excellent.
referring to.
Yeah.
So it's on presentbetter.org is my website, and in the blog section, I've done a write up on it. And there are a couple of other connections to it. I actually just did a LinkedIn post too a couple days ago. I'll try and find that actually as we cut out here, because it does a breakdown. I did a carousel post, and I did a breakdown of the whole talk. It's like
Oh, that's
it's
so
a
cool.
3-minute talk. It's like a
Mhm.
7 carousel post, and it breaks down each section and what's going on in that section and why it works. So, Mark, you wrap us up, and I'll go find that post so I can pop it in the up.
It looks like it has
Chris
been
Chris
found.
may have
Chris found it.
beat us to it.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that the post, Chris? That may be the post there.
yeah. That's a link to your post.
I don't know.
Yeah. One thing I'll say as we wrap up with respect to connection is we've been talking about like verbal devices. What you're going to say to establish this connection, how you decide what to say. Connection can also be nonverbal cues, right? Like smiling, nodding, making eye contact, which sometimes can be difficult for speakers. I don't mean to stare, but in engaging, moving around a little bit. Again, for a general audience, I never stand at a podium. That to me signals one-way communication, and people get bored of that very quickly. It's just like if anyone has had children and you say, "Is the baby tracking?" Are they, because they that's a very well established developmental milestone, is tracking with the eyes, and people tend to focus on faces, right? And so there are nonverbal ways of connecting as well. And you can think about that. I know, just kind of tacking it on to the end, but I think the overall message that Andy and I want to really emphasize today is connection is often the forgotten, underemphasized, nice to have element of communication. And people who believe that, I would suggest, are missing out on really a critical part of effective interaction and communication.
Yeah, I'd agree. The connection, you have to lead with connection.
Yeah.
You connection is a necessary part of the equation. And one of the things I'd actually add to this that I think speaks nicely to the science and research community is it's not just connection to the presenter. So we're not just talking about connecting with the presenter and charisma and having a
Mhm.
presence and people liking you. We're also talking about getting it so your audience connects to your research. Because
Mhm.
ultimately
Exactly.
that's what the connection's for. The connection's not so you like me. The connection's so you're interested in what I'm talking about. The presenter is the vehicle through which we connect. And this is why sometimes we get these presenters who are fabulous presenters. Oh, did you see that person present? They were fantastic. Oh yeah, what did they talk about? I don't really remember. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're
Yeah.
trying to do is get people to connect not only to us, but to our research and our message, which speaks back to what Chris was saying a moment ago of reflecting and having time to think
Yeah.
and reflect and digest and process. And Joanne was asking, connecting with a big room
Mhm.
of 200 people.
Yeah.
again, they need time. They need time to connect. And too often we jam too much into too little.
Yeah. And
Takes
I'll
us
just
kind of full circle to our first episode. Less is more.
yeah. Yeah. And I know we're right at time. I also want to add to Joanne, one thing you can consider doing is asking questions. So, if I talk about, there could be, 500 people in the room. But if I'm talking and then I say, how many people have ever seen this? Or tell me an example of this. Or when was the last time you experienced that? How, has anyone ever been affected by this? Anyone have a relative who has this particular cancer that I'm researching right now? Right. So that kind of interaction, it's content diversity. So meaning it's not just a lecture, also helps to establish connection.
As we sign off here, we'll leave with Chris's thought. Um, Through line, story, repetition,
Yeah.
foreshadowing. How do we seed the waters for what it is we'll talk about later? When we say something, I love when you can trigger this in the audience. You say something, 10 minutes in, 15 minutes in, they're like, "Oh, that's why you said that earlier. I was wondering why you said that earlier." Because they remember something that you said earlier. They weren't quite sure why you had said it, but you come back to it later.
Yeah.
And this is when talks become magical, when there's connective tissue, when it's not when the whole the sum of the sum of the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it
Yeah.
just it all comes together. It all comes together at the end.
Yeah.
The
And I'm
story, the statistics, the connection, the research, it all comes together.
love it.
Got 30
I love it.
seconds, Mark, to close us.
I just what Andy was saying on that. So, like, such a great point. Why does that appeal to the audience? Number one, the audience like, oh, I'm in on it. I get it. He said this, and now he just referred back to it. I'm like part of the like inside of the message. And second is, I better keep paying attention because maybe he's going to connect it in a different way. It's interesting. Such a great point.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you, anyone else who is out there listening. We appreciate you spending time with us on a Tuesday afternoon. We'll be back for one more Tuesday afternoon before we take a break for the holidays. Mark, thank you. This is tons of fun. I look forward to it.
Mhm.
And we will shoot some, we'll pass some ideas back and forth between me and Mark for topics next week. If Joanne or Chris, if you have something you'd love to hear us talk about, or anyone else in the audience, feel free to send us a DM or an email, and we'd be happy to take on your favorite topic for a show.
Thanks for your
Cheers,
comments
everybody.
too.
Thank you.
Have a great week. Bye bye.